Okay, imagine for a second, you're looking at a photo, right? A photo of a flying arrow. In that split second, that frozen instant, the arrow's not actually moving, is
Well,
it?
no, it's just
Yeah,
stationary,
right.
occupying its own space.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Now, what if I told you that according to, well, one of the most brilliant, maybe audacious minds in history, if that arrow is motionless at every single instant,
Hmm.
then it can't actually be moving at all.
Or that walking across a room is impossible.
Yeah. Like every time you try, you're actually facing this infinite series of halfway points, meaning you can never logically get to the other side. What if, the really basic stuff we experience, motion, change, even just the fact that there's more than one thing out there,
Yeah.
what if it's all just
Yeah.
an illusion?
A trick of the senses.
Right. Well, get ready to have your reality maybe slightly bent today, because we are taking a deep dive into the fascinating, seriously mind-bending world of Zenon of Elea. He was an ancient Greek philosopher, 5th century BCE, the kind of thinker who basically looked at common sense and just,
Mhm.
politely, but very firmly, said, maybe let's look at that again.
Indeed. And Xenon is just, well, he's a monumental figure in philosophy. Really, because he was the first to systematically use paradoxes, those seemingly impossible contradictions right in the heart of philosophical arguments.
Okay.
His goal, and it was pretty audacious, was to challenge our everyday gut feelings about things like change and movement and the idea that there are lots of different
That's
things.
curiosity, yeah.
Exactly. He wanted to show that these things are, well, logically impossible if you really follow certain assumptions through.
Wow. So our mission today, unpack all of this. We're going to look at who Zenon actually was, this radical school of thought he belonged to, and the main event, really, will dissect his 4 most famous paradoxes.
The big ones.
Yeah. And not just what they say, but why they were such a big deal back then, why they completely shook up ancient thought, and honestly, why they still echo today. In maths, logic, our whole idea of reality. For this deep dive, we're drawing on excerpts from Zenon of Elea, Paradoxes of Reality and Reason, and some other really useful materials that help shed light on him. Okay, so to really get Zenon's impact, let's paint the picture. Before him, what was ancient Greek philosophy generally like? And how did Elea, his home, which was just a Greek colony, right? How did it become this hotbed for such a totally different way of thinking?
Right. To understand Xenon, you got to step back into that early 5th century BCE Greek world. It was a time of huge intellectual change. I mean, really buzzing with new ideas.
Right.
Before the Eleatics came along, the main players were the Ionian nature philosophers. Thinkers like Thales of Miletus and Anaximander.
And one's looking for the fundamental stuff.
Exactly. They were sort of the earliest scientists in a way. They were searching for the arche, the basic principle or substance that everything comes from and is made of.
Like Thales and water.
Precisely. Thales thought it was water. Anaximander proposed this sort of undefined, boundless thing called the aperon. They were looking at the world around them, plants growing, rivers flowing, seasons changing, and trying to explain how all this change and variety worked based on natural laws and material stuff.
So they accepted change and multiplicity as real and tried to figure out the how.
Yes, they absolutely took the observed world, the world of change, as their starting point. They weren't really questioning if things change, but how that change happened based on some underlying unity.
Okay, so that was the mainstream. Then along comes Elea. What was special about this place? Southern Italy, right?
Yeah, Elea was a Greek colony in southern Italy, and during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, it was actually a really vibrant place. Lots of trade, cultural exchange, people coming and going from all over the Mediterranean. And it's here that something radically different starts brewing.
Led
by Parmenides, Zenon's teacher, and a hugely influential, almost prophetic figure. Parmenides dropped a philosophical bombshell. He proposed something completely revolutionary, basically the polar opposite of what the Ionians believed.
Which was?
Being is one.
Just one.
Indivisible, unchanging, eternal. He argued that change, multiplicity, movement, all the stuff the Ionians were trying to explain were illusions, mere tricks played on us by our senses.
Wow. That's a massive claim. How did he even argue that?
Well, his core argument was that anything that is truly is must be. It can't not be. And it can't change into something else because that would mean it becomes something it is not, or that non-being somehow arises. And for Parmenides, non-being was literally unthinkable, impossible.
Okay, so change implies becoming something you're not, which is impossible. Multiplicity implies things are separate, distinct, which breaks the oneness.
You got it. It was a direct challenge to the very foundation of the earlier philosophers. He was essentially saying, look, your whole project is based on a mistake. You're trying to explain illusions.
So forget what you see and hear. Trust only pure reason. That must have been Zenon's starting point then.
Absolutely. Parmenides' core belief, which Zenon took up with, well, incredible vesh, was that our senses are fundamentally unreliable. They show us this world of flux of many things, but true understanding, grasping reality, that only comes through logos, through pure reason. If reason tells you something is contradictory, like motion, then it can't be real, no matter how much it looks real.
A total elevation of logic over experience.
Exactly. And it's probably worth mentioning the background noise, the political situation. It was a pretty turbulent time.
Right. City-states fighting, the Persian threat.
Yeah, intense rivalries, Persian invasions, internal struggles between democracy and oligarchy. All this instability, especially for smaller colonies like Elea, probably pushed them to carve out a unique intellectual identity. Maybe being radical, challenging the status quo was a way to make their mark. Philosophy wasn't just abstract navel-gazing. It was part of the public discourse, reflecting the anxieties and ambitions of the time.
So intellectual defiance as a form of identity. Makes sense. Okay, that really sets the stage for Zenon. I mean, here's a guy essentially telling everyone, you're all wrong about reality. What do we actually know about him, though? The man himself. Was he some kind of hermit? Or out there debating everyone?
Yeah, it's a great question, and honestly, the answer is a bit frustrating. We don't have a ton of solid info. Most of what we know comes from much later sources, like Diogenes Laertius, who wrote biographies centuries after Zenon lived.
So maybe take it with a grain of salt.
Definitely some salt required. There's a legendary feel to some of it, more myth than hard fact, perhaps.
Okay, but what are the basics? Where and when?
Okay, so born around 490 BCE in Elea, and he's famously known not just as Parmenides' student, but also apparently his adopted son.
Adopted son. Wow, that's close.
It suggests a really deep connection, right? Both personal and intellectual. He would have been completely immersed in that Eleatic way of thinking from a very young age, like inheriting a philosophical mantle.
So practically raised on paradoxes. Did he stay in Elea his whole life?
Well, he was clearly sharp and active in philosophical circles early on. And one event that seems pretty well attested, more historical, is a trip he took to Athens with Parmenides. This was probably around 450 BCE.
Athens, the big leagues, Pericles' time.
Exactly. Athens was at its peak intellectually. And apparently Zenon went there and debated with some of the top minds, people in Pericles' circle.
Imagine that. This guy from a colony in Italy schooling the Athenian intellectual.
Right. It shows that Eleatic thought wasn't just some obscure regional thing. It was powerful enough to make waves in the absolute center of the Greek intellectual world. He must have made quite an impression presenting these arguments that just pulled the rug out from under their basic assumptions about reality.
Must have ruffled some feathers. What about later in his life? Any more stories?
Well, the later stories get even murkier, more dramatic. There are these unconfirmed tales about him getting involved in political plots against a tyrant or something.
Ooh, intrigue.
Yeah, leading to various rumored ends, execution, torture where he supposedly bit off his own tongue rather than reveal names, or maybe just exile.
Whoa. Heroic defiance or just legends growing over time?
It's really hard to say. These stories definitely have mythical elements, maybe reflecting how compelling or controversial he was seen later on. But they do paint a picture of someone potentially deeply engaged with the real world, not just abstract thought, maybe someone who paid a price for his convictions.
Adds to the mystique, for sure. A fearless logician, maybe even a political resistor. Okay, so it sounds like he wasn't just a follower of Parmenides, but more like his chief defender, his philosophical champion. What was the absolute core idea of this Eleatic school that he devoted himself to? And what was Zenon trying to do with all these bizarre-sounding paradoxes?
You nailed it. Philosophical champion is a good way to put it. The absolute core idea, the central belief of the Eleatic school was stark and revolutionary. Being is one. Change and multiplicity are a deception.
One reality. Everything else, smoke and mirrors.
Pretty much. It's what philosophers call ontological monism. Ontology deals with the nature of being, what's real. Monism means reality is fundamentally one single thing. They believed that true reality could only be grasped by reason, by pure thought, our senses. They trick us. They show us a world buzzing with change, filled with countless different objects. But that's not the real reality, according to them.
And this all stems from Parmenides' big idea.
Directly. It all builds on Parmenides' foundational claim. Being exists and is one, non-being is unthinkable. Think about that last part. Non-being is unthinkable. You can't truly conceive of nothingness. You can't talk about what isn't.
Right.
And crucially, you can't move into non-being, and things can't change into non-being. If change means something becomes different, moving from one state to another, or something comes into being from non-being and non-being is impossible, well, then change itself becomes logically impossible.
Okay, I see the trap. And if everything is just one solid block of being, there's nothing else for it to change into or for different things to pop loan of?
Exactly. No room for movement, no room for division, no room for becoming, just one eternal, unchanging reality.
That's a tough pill to swallow for.
Uh,
Well, everyone who experiences literally anything else. So Xenon's job was to make everyone swallow it.
Sort of. His main role wasn't so much to prove Parmenides' idea directly, but to act as its fiercest defender by attacking the alternatives. His goal was to logically demolish any philosophy that accepted multiplicity, change, or motion as real, basically. Any view that contradicted Parmenides' one.
So he went on the offensive. How did the paradoxes fit into that strategy?
That was the strategy. His unique method was to create these paradoxes by taking his opponent's own assumptions, things they believed, like motion is real, or space can be infinitely divided, and then showing, through rigorous step-by-step logic, that those assumptions led to ridiculous contradictions.
Oh, so turning their own logic against them, like philosophical judo.
Exactly like philosophical judo. He'd say, okay, you believe in motion, let's see where that leads. And then he'd lay out the steps to show it ends in absurdity. It's vital to get that these weren't just clever brain teasers or debating tricks.
Right, not just for fun.
No, they were serious logical assaults. They were designed to expose the hidden inconsistencies in how we normally think about the world and to force people towards the Eleatic conclusion. The world of the senses must be illusory because it leads to these logical impossibilities. Only the unchanging one is logically coherent.
Okay, let's get to the main event then. The paradoxes themselves. You said they were more than just puzzles. They were serious challenges to how people understood the world back then. Let's break them down. Where do we start?
Let's start with the dichotomia paradox, or the bisection paradox. This one's fundamental. Zenon says, imagine you want to move from point A to point B. Could be across a room, could be anywhere.
Okay, simple enough.
Well, he argues before you can get to B, you have to get halfway there. Right?
Sure,
Makes
makes sense.
But once you get to that halfway point, you then have to cover half of the remaining distance to get to B. And once you cover that next quarter of the total distance, you still have an eighth left. And you have to cover half of that, and then half of the 16th and half the 32nd.
Oh, I see where this is going. It never ends.
Exactly. Ad infinitum. It implies there's an infinite number of smaller and smaller steps you have to complete to reach any destination, no matter how close it seems.
And since you can't complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite time...
Boom. Motion is logically impossible. You can never actually arrive.
Yeah.
He's trapping you in an infinite regress based on the idea that space can be divided forever.
Wow. Okay, so what's the deeper philosophical point he's making here? Beyond just, you can't walk across the room.
Well, what's fascinating is that this is one of the very first really explicit, rigorous discussions about the infinite divisibility of space and time. He's asking fundamental questions. If space and time can be chopped up infinitely, how do things like motion, which seem continuous, even happen? How do these infinitely small bits, these infinitesimals, add up to anything real? It threw down a huge challenge to mathematicians and philosophers about the nature of continuity itself. Problems that, frankly, weren't really sorted out mathematically for over 2,000 years.
Incredible. Okay, what's next? The famous one.
Yeah, probably the most famous. The Achilles and the tortoise paradox. This one really gets people thinking.
The super fast runner versus the slow tortoise.
Right. Achilles, the swiftest hero, is racing a tortoise. Being sporty, he gives the tortoise a head start.
Okay.
Zenon argues, Achilles starts running. When he reaches the point where the tortoise started, the tortoise obviously hasn't just been sitting there, it's crawled ahead a little bit.
Sure, a tiny bit.
So Achilles now has to run to that new spot. But by the time Achilles gets there, the tortoise has crawled ahead just a little bit more.
Ah, same logic as the dichotomy, basically.
Exactly. This process repeats infinitely. Every time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has already moved slightly further ahead. Therefore, Zenon concludes, the swift Achilles can logically never overtake the slow tortoise.
But that's crazy. We know Achilles would just blow past the tortoise in reality.
Of course. And that's the power of the paradox. It clashes so strongly with our intuition and experience. But logically, following Zenon's steps based on the infinite divisibility of space and time, it seems weirdly sound. It deepens that inquiry from the dichotomy paradox. It forces us to ask, How does Achilles actually close that gap? Where does the infinite series of smaller and smaller distances get resolved in reality? It really puts the pressure on explaining how continuous motion works against this idea of infinite points.
It really makes you question what continuous even means. Okay,
Huh.
what about the arrow? You mentioned that one in the intro.
Right, the arrow paradox. This one tackles motion from a slightly different angle, focusing on time. Think about an arrow flying through the air.
Got it.
Xenon says, consider the arrow at any single indivisible instant of time, like a single frame in a movie. At that precise moment, that frozen now is the arrow moving.
Well, no, in that instant, it's just there, occupying a space equal to its length.
Exactly. It's motionless within that instant. It's just located at a specific point. Now, argues Xenon, if time is just made up of a series of these indivisible instants, like stringing together still photos,
And the arrow is motionless in every single one of those instants.
then where does the motion come from? If it's not moving in any given now, how can it be moving over all the nows? He concludes the arrow must be motionless throughout its entire flight. Motion itself is an illusion created by stringing together moments of stillness.
Whoa. Okay, that raises a huge question. If everything is static at every instant, how does change or movement happen between instants? Like, how does the movie play if every frame is still?
Precisely. It directly challenges whether time is a continuous flow or a sequence of discrete moments. And it forces us to define what motion fundamentally is. Is it about being in different places at different times? But if at any time you're in only one place, it gets very tricky very fast.
My brain hurts already. Okay, one more. The stadium. This one sounds different.
Yeah, the stadium paradox, or moving rows, is a bit more complex, and scholars sometimes debate its exact meaning. But the usual interpretation deals with relative motion.
Relative motion, like Einstein stuff.
Sort of a very, very early precursor, maybe?
Yeah.
Imagine 3 rows of objects, let's say blocks, all of equal size. Row A is stationary. Row B is moving to the right past row A. Row C is moving to the left past row A at the same speed as B, but in the opposite direction.
Okay, got the setup. A is still, B goes right, C goes left.
Now, Xenon points out something about how they pass each other. From the perspective of a stationary block in row A block in row B takes a certain amount of time to pass it. Same for a block in row C. But now consider a block in row B. How fast does it see the blocks in row C go past? Since B and C are moving towards each other, a C block will pass a B block in half the time it takes a C block to pass a stationary A block.
Okay, yeah, because they're closing the distance faster relative to each other.
Exactly. So the time it takes for a C block to pass a B block is half the time it takes to pass an A block. But Xenon supposedly argued this implies that a unit of time, the time it takes C to pass B, is equal to half of itself, since the A passage time was considered the basic unit. Or, more broadly, it suggests that measurements of speed and time are relative to the observer's frame of reference.
So there's no single absolute speed. It depends on who's watching.
That's the key implication often drawn from it. It suggests motion isn't absolute, but relative. How fast something is moving depends on your own state of motion. This was a very early, perhaps rudimentary, hint at the concept of frames of reference, which is absolutely fundamental in physics today. It questions the very idea of an objective, universal measure of motion.
Okay, so these aren't just fun riddles to puzzle over. They sound like they had some serious consequences. What does it all mean? Why were they such a big deal, shaking up philosophy and, it sounds like, even pointing towards future math and physics?
Oh, absolutely. Far from being just tricks, Zenon's paradoxes were a real turning point. They forced thinkers to confront assumptions they hadn't even realized they were making about reality, about space, time, infinity, and they showed the sheer power of logical argument.
So what were the biggest ripple effects? You mentioned infinity and continuity.
Yeah, that's probably the most massive one. Continuity and infinity. Before Xenon, you had the Ionian philosophers talking about the arche, but they mostly glossed over the really hard questions about how you get continuous change and division from a fundamental substance. Xenon just dives right into the messiness of it.
The dichotomy in Achilles.
Exactly. Those paradoxes forced people to wrestle with the idea of summing up an infinite number of things. How can infinitely many tiny steps add up to a finite distance? How do you complete an infinite series? This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It spurred huge debates in ancient mathematics about fractions, about magnitudes, about irrational numbers, numbers like pi or the square root of 2 that couldn't be expressed as simple fractions.
So it pushed math forward.
Immensely. The concepts of infinity and continuity that Xenon put under the microscope were, in a very real sense, the seeds that eventually grew into calculus, thousands of years later.
Wait, calculus. Like Newton and Leibniz?
Because calculus is precisely the mathematical tool developed to handle these kinds of problems, rates of change, and summing up infinite series of infinitesimally small quantities. The concept of a limit in calculus is exactly what allows mathematicians to rigorously say, yes, this infinite sum, 12 plus 14 plus 18, actually does converge to a finite number, 1. It provides the framework to resolve the apparent contradictions Zenon highlighted. It shows how philosophy can literally pose the questions that mathematics then needs to invent tools to answer.
That is genuinely mind-blowing. An ancient Greek paradox laying the conceptual groundwork for calculus. Okay, beyond math, what about how people argued how philosophy itself was done?
Huge impact there, too, on logic and dialectic. Zenon really honed this method of refutation through contradiction, what the Greeks called reductio ad absurdum.
Reducing to absurdity.
Exactly. Take your opponent's premise, accept it for the sake of argument, and then logically show it leads to nonsense. This systematic adversarial approach was incredibly influential. It paved the way for Socrates' method, the elenchus, where he'd question people relentlessly to expose contradictions in their beliefs.
Ah, the Socratic method.
Yeah. And it also laid groundwork for Aristotle's more formal system of logic, the syllogism, which is all about structured deductive reasoning. Zenon showed how logic could be used as a precise tool, almost like a weapon, to dissect arguments and pursue truth. He made rigorous arguments central to philosophy.
Okay, and what about the big picture of reality itself, ontology and knowing?
Right, epistemology and ontology. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, how do we know things. Ontology is the study of being what exists. Zenon drove a huge wedge between appearance and reality. He vividly demonstrated our senses might show us one thing, like motion, but reason, if followed rigorously, might tell us something completely different, that motion is impossible.
So trust reason over the senses.
That was the Eleatic message, yeah. This sharp distinction was crucial. It marks a really important early stage in epistemology. Later figures like Plato ran with this, arguing for the superiority of reason and his world of ideal forms over the deceptive sensory world. Aristotle tried to find more of a balance, but Zenon put that core problem, appearance versus reality, senses versus reason, right at the center of the philosophical agenda. It forced everyone after him to grapple with the question of how we can truly know what's real.
It definitely sounds like Zenon wasn't just tossing these ideas out into a void. He was operating in a really lively, maybe even combative intellectual scene, right? It helps to understand who else was arguing about what.
Oh, absolutely. It was a genuine philosophical battleground. You can't understand Zenon without seeing who he was arguing against and who else was throwing ideas into the ring.
So the main opponents were the Ionians we talked about earlier.
They were the primary target, yes. The Ionian nature philosophers. The contrast couldn't be starker. Ionians, trying to explain, observed change and multiplicity based on some underlying natural substance. Eleatics, especially Parmenides and Zenon, arguing that change and multiplicity are illusions fundamentally incompatible with true being.
Like Heraclitus saying everything flows.
Exactly. Heraclitus, with his everything flows, constantly changing reality, was the perfect foil for Parmenides' static, unchanging one. You couldn't step in the same river twice versus reality as a solid, eternal block. But what's cool is how these opposing views actually pushed philosophy forward. They forced each side to sharpen their arguments, define their terms, and explore the very limits of logic and reality.
So they kind of needed each other, in a way. Who else was in the mix? What about the sophists? They had a pretty different approach, didn't they?
Very different. The sophists were rising around this time, too, and they shifted the focus dramatically. Thinkers like Protagoras, famous for man is the measure of all things, turned away from these big questions about the cosmos and being. They focused on human affairs. Society, politics, rhetoric, practical skills.
And truth was relative for them.
Largely, yes. They often viewed knowledge as relative, dependent on perspective or convention, and emphasized persuasive speaking, sometimes over objective truth. This put them in direct opposition to Zenon's relentless pursuit of absolute, logical truth, knowable only by reason. For Zenon, truth was singular and unchanging. For many sophists, it was pliable and human-centered, a real clash of worldviews.
Okay, and then there were the atomists. Weren't they trying to kind of bridge the gap?
Exactly. The atomists, like Leucippus and his student Democritus, offered a really ingenious alternative. They tried to reconcile the Eleatic challenge, the impossibility of change and division in a single one, with the obvious appearance of change and multiplicity.
Atoms in the void.
Precisely. They proposed that reality was made of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms, from atomos, meaning uncuttable, moving around an empty space, the void. So you could have multiplicity, lots of atoms, and motion, atoms moving in the void, without infinite divisibility, because the atoms themselves were fundamental and couldn't be cut.
A clever workaround.
Yeah.
But did Zenon's paradoxes still pose a problem for them?
Oh, yes. Zenon's arguments were a serious challenge even for the atomists. Okay, so atoms move, but how do they move from point A to point B across the void? Do they jump instantaneously? Or do they still have to traverse the space between points? If space itself is still infinitely divisible, even if the atoms aren't, don't you run into the same dichotomy or Achilles problems regarding their movement through the void? The atomists had to refine their ideas about motion and the nature of the void, partly in response to these Eleatic critiques.
Wow, so his arguments kept pushing everyone to get more precise.
Definitely. And remember, the backdrop, the socio-political conditions, Athens becoming a democracy, the aftermath of the Persian Wars, growing trade and wealth, all this created more space and interest for public debate, including philosophy.
So philosophy wasn't just for scholars in ivory towers.
Not at all. It was moving into the agora, the public square. Zenon's visit to Athens and engaging with Pericles' circle shows this. Ideas were being tested, debated, and had real relevance for how people understood the world and their place in it. Philosophical muscle flexing was part of the culture.
It's just amazing to think these arguments, hammered out over 2,400 years ago in Greece, are still being talked about. How did Zenon's paradoxes keep influencing thinkers down through the centuries, right up to, well, today?
Yeah, the echoes are incredibly persistent. Because Zenon hit on something so fundamental, his challenges just couldn't be swept under the rug. They demanded a response, either by accepting his conclusions, which few were willing to do entirely, or by finding really robust ways to counter them.
Who took the first big swing at solving them? Aristotle.
Aristotle was hugely important here. First off, we owe him a massive debt just for documenting Zenon's paradoxes so carefully in his own works, particularly the physics. A lot of what we know about Zenon's actual arguments comes directly through Aristotle.
Okay, so he preserved them. Did he solve them?
Well, he offered influential solutions. He directly tackled Zenon's assumptions. He argued that motion isn't a series of static instants, but a continuous process. And crucially, he made this distinction between potential infinity and actual infinity.
Potential versus actual, what does that mean?
Aristotle said space and time are potentially infinite, meaning you can always conceptually divide any distance or duration further. There's no smallest bit you can't imagine dividing. But, he argued, they are never actually divided into an infinite number of points or instants at any given moment. A line segment contains potentially infinite points, but it's not actually composed of them like beads on a string.
Ah, so the infinite division is only a possibility, not a completed reality.
Exactly. And that distinction allowed him to say, look, Achilles can cross the infinite potential halfway points because the distance is a continuous whole, not an actual infinite series of tasks to be completed. This framework was incredibly influential and largely held sway for centuries as the standard way to diffuse the paradoxes.
Okay, so Aristotle found a way around them. But did the core Eleatic idea that deep reality is unchanging, did that influence anyone else big? Plato, maybe?
Oh, absolutely. You can see a very strong Eleatic influence in Plato's idealism. Think about Plato's famous theory of forms.
The perfect, unchanging blueprints of things.
Exactly. For Plato, the physical world we perceive with our senses, the world of change, decay, multiplicity, is just a shadow, an imperfect copy of a higher reality. The world of forms, these forms, the perfect idea of chair or justice or beauty, are eternal, unchanging, and truly real. And how do we access them?
Through reason, not the senses.
Precisely. Just like Parmenides and Zenon argued, Plato builds directly on that Eleatic foundation. Senses deceive, reason reveals true, unchanging being. The whole structure of Plato's metaphysics owes a significant debt to the Eleatic challenge to the reality of the sensory world.
Wow, okay, and then jumping way forward, the connection to calculus you mentioned, that seems like the ultimate mathematical response.
It really is. The impact on mathematics and continuity is profound. Zenon's paradoxes kept highlighting these deep logical problems with infinity and continuity that ancient and medieval math struggled to fully resolve. They kept bumping up against these issues. It wasn't until the 17th century, with Newton and Leibniz independently inventing calculus,
that they finally got the tools they needed.
Right. Calculus, with its rigorous concept of limits, finally provided the mathematical machinery to define continuity precisely and to understand how an infinite series of decreasing terms could converge to a finite sum. It could mathematically demonstrate how Achilles catches the tortoise by showing that the sum of those infinite, ever-decreasing time intervals needed to cover the shrinking distances is finite.
So calculus didn't just ignore Xenon, it actually solved the mathematical puzzle he posed.
In a rigorous mathematical sense, yes. It showed the deep link between philosophical problems and mathematical innovation. Zenon's logical puzzles literally helped drive the development of one of the most powerful mathematical tools ever created.
That's incredible. And does Xenon still pop up in philosophy today?
Absolutely. In modern philosophy, those core problems, the nature of infinity, continuity, motion, time, the relationship between a whole and its parts, appearance versus reality, they're still very much alive. Philosophers of physics grapple with the nature of space-time at quantum levels, asking if it's ultimately smooth or discrete. Logicians still analyze the structure of Zenon's arguments. Metaphysicians still debate the nature of change and persistence. Zenon opened a Pandora's box of fundamental questions that continue to challenge and fascinate us. Hashtag tag tag outro.
What an absolutely fascinating journey into Xenon's world. He really wasn't just making clever riddles, was he? He was this incredibly rigorous thinker, pushing logic to its absolute limit to make us question everything we thought we knew.
Yeah, he was much more than a puzzle maker. His impact was just immense, and it resonates in so many ways. If you boil it down, he fundamentally highlighted that huge gap between how things appear to our senses and what pure reason tells us might be logically possible or impossible.
Forcing that confrontation between experience and logic.
Exactly. He also, maybe without realizing the full extent of it, kickstarted serious inquiry into knowledge itself, epistemology. How do we know what's true? What's the role of reason versus senses? That becomes central.
Right.
And as we saw, he created this unavoidable intersection between philosophy and mathematics around these incredibly tricky concepts: infinity, continuity, divisibility. His paradoxes basically threw down a gauntlet that mathematicians eventually had to pick up.
Leading to calculus. Amazing.
Yeah. And finally, his method, that reductio ad absurdum, refuting arguments by showing they lead to contradiction, that became a fundamental tool in the philosophical toolkit. The whole dialectical method owes a lot to him.
So the Eleatic challenge wasn't just a weird detour. It was a really pivotal moment. It shaped Plato, Aristotle, and its ripples just kept spreading right into modern science and philosophy. It really makes you appreciate how asking seemingly simple, almost naive questions like, can things really move, can lead to revolutionary insights.
Absolutely. Sometimes the most profound thinking comes from questioning the totally obvious.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. The next time you toss a ball or just walk across the room, what does Zenon's challenge make you wonder? About the reality of that simple movement, but the very nature of the time and space you're moving through.
Could there be other illusions, other assumptions we take for granted, just waiting for someone to expose them with pure, rigorous reason? It's a question Zenon definitely would have wanted us to keep asking.